From Yahoo Finance, this is Electionomics. I'm Rick Newman.
And I'm Alexis Christoforous. Welcome to our new normal here at Yahoo Finance. As you can see, this podcast doesn't look the way it usually does. Rick Newman and I are in separate places. We are using Google Hangouts to bring you this video podcast in this world of coronavirus. And today we're going to start talking about how this COVID-19 is affecting the 2020 presidential election. So, Rick, what are you doing there in your room?
I'm surviving, and I don't have to worry about infecting anybody or being infected by anybody.
Yeah, same here. All right, great.
Without getting the evil eye.
Yeah, no, you don't, and it is so true. You know, you don't want to cough or sneeze near anybody or anything because you will get the evil eye.
I'm going to try not to cough, just so you know, because I think people might just have that instant reaction. But anyway, let's stop talking about the virus. Or I guess
we're going to talk about it, but in a different way, because I want to talk about how this coronavirus has really come to define Donald Trump's presidency at a time when he is looking at whether or not he's going to remain president in just a few months. It's hard to sort of think past where we are now and look out to November. But so far, given his response, his administration's response to this pandemic, do you think odds are for a Trump reelection or against?
Suddenly, they seem to be changing on a daily basis. And you know, I just have to say, we thought we were getting whiplash with the abrupt change in the Democratic presidential race. We've been talking about that for the last couple of podcasts with Joe Biden, you know, rising from the dead and suddenly looking like a shoo-in. And then all of a sudden, really within, again, less than 2 weeks, it's almost as if the whole economy is falling off a cliff. The whole country is changing the way it does its business. Everybody's staying home, or they are in many places. So here's one of the things that caught my attention first thing this week. I get a lot of political newsletters and things like that. So I opened one from Sandhill Strategy. That's a research firm in Washington, D.C. They do political analysis and things like that. Here's the headline: Joe Biden, likely the next president. So what these analysts at Sandhill Strategy are saying, they're kind of keeping it simple and not basing this forecast, if you will, on anything that President Trump is actually doing in terms of how he's responding to the coronavirus crisis, but on a simple fact that we're almost certainly going to be in a recession later this year. So leading into the election, we will be in a recession. It looks as if it's going to be a deep recession. Now, it might be a short recession, but it's going to be painful for some period of time. And there just has been no president since the Great Depression who has gotten elected either during a recession or in the aftermath of a recession. I mean, every time there is a recession in the United States and there's an incumbent president running for re-election, he loses. And to point out just how stark, I mean, this is a 100% correlation. And just to point out how stark this is, to go back to when I had first started in journalism, was in around 1991, and I remember being a young journalist watching the Gulf War unfold. In early 1991, you know, the shock and awe campaign, the air war, and the smart bombs. That was a decisive U.S. military victory. President George H.W. Bush's approval rating went as high as 85 or 86% back then, and he lost. He lost. I mean, back then they thought no president who presides over a winning war, especially in such a decisive fashion, could ever lose a re-election, and he lost because there was a recession that came, and it actually was over by the time of the election in '92. But the aftermath of the recession still had people feeling anxious, and that was a fairly mild recession, and George H.W. Bush lost. So if you're just looking at the correlation between recessions and presidential re-election odds, Trump is in deep trouble.
But you have to admit, this is a very, very unique situation. I don't know if we can look back in history and find a situation similar to this in an election year. Could it possibly be that the electorate says, you know what, this is not the time to shake things up in Washington. We need stability there with the administration. Let's keep the same president in. Could that kind of thinking work in favor of Trump?
I think so many things could happen. So it might be not just what you described, but it's possible that Trump could find that voters are sort of rallying around him, which is what might happen if this were a terrorist attack, let's say. So, the nation rallied around George W. Bush in 2001 after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Is it possible something like that could happen? I guess it is. You're now hearing Trump just, his rhetoric. He calls this a war. We're fighting an enemy in the virus. He characterizes it as a foreign virus, as if, we have been attacked by some foreign interest. Could that sway voters? I guess it could, and I will. I freely acknowledge, man, anything could happen here. But Trump is so divisive to start with. And he's just not somebody who unifies the country. He's just not. And even amid this crisis, he's taking pot shots at governors he doesn't like. So he doesn't like the Democratic governors of Michigan or of New York. So while he's on the phone trying to manage this crisis, he gets off and he tweets or he has something nasty to say about Democratic governors. So I don't think Trump is the kind of president who actually can unify people. And, we're going to see a giant drop in Democratic turnout in the remaining primaries. But I don't think Democrats are suddenly going to say, 7 months from now, oh, we've had this virus and this national crisis. Maybe I don't need to go vote. Maybe Trump's actually doing okay. I just think that's not going to happen. Unless the health situation is actually dramatically worse by November, I think Democrats are still going to turn out in record numbers, and I think you're probably going to see some independents, turning out in high numbers as well. And I just don't think that's good for Trump. I could be totally wrong about all this. I mean, it's almost hard to predict anything these days, but I do think Trump is going to lose.
And now I want to talk about Biden and Sanders and these primaries, because we saw the primary in Ohio being pushed to, I think it's June, right? Yeah. The governor did there. So what's going to happen to the other primaries, and what's going to happen to Sanders? I mean, some are wondering, why is he still in this race?
Well, the first effect here, to my mind, is that it's a reprieve for Bernie Sanders. It gives him an excuse to stay in the race a little bit. I know you're laughing. I think even some Sanders supporters are starting to say, Bernie, it's time to go, man. And, you really just look like you're trying to keep hogging your little bit of the limelight as it keeps moving away from you. It's like you still keep sticking your head in the picture, trying to get in there. But Bernie Sanders, we heard him in the last debate. He's kind of like, he's still something of a force within the Democratic Party. It seems like what's going on is there's sort of this tacit negotiation between Joe Biden, who, unless there's something surprising happens, he's going to be the presidential nominee for the Democrats in 2020. There could be a health issue. He is 77 years old. We've talked about that before. I don't think it's crass to just point out what's obviously on people's minds. So I guess Bernie Sanders, maybe he can argue that he should stay in for that reason. But what does seem to be going on is they're sort of negotiating Bernie Sanders' terms of surrender. So what is it going to take for Bernie Sanders to fully support Joe Biden if he's the nominee, and not just for Bernie Sanders himself to support Biden, but more important than that, for Bernie Sanders to tell all of his supporters, go vote for Joe Biden in the general election. Don't sit home. Don't vote for Trump. Go vote for Joe Biden, to really convince them. And I think that's why you're actually seeing Joe Biden. He has been giving a little bit of ground on some issues, going a little bit closer to the Bernie Sanders line. He's not doing that on the big one, which is Medicare for all. But he did do it on education, and he has had some nice things to say about Elizabeth Warren's education plan, which is more generous about free college for fill in the blank X portion of students. Bernie Sanders wants to make it 100%. Elizabeth Warren's is more like 70 or 80%. Joe Biden wants free 2-year community college for people who are interested in that, which would be much lower.
The way the public feels about what the Trump administration has done thus far. There's been a few polls out that show that people's confidence doesn't necessarily lie with the president or even at the federal level. It seems as though a lot of Americans are either trusting health organizations like the CDC over the president, or even trusting their local or state governments more than they do government at the federal level. That's not a good sign for Trump as we move closer to the general election.
I think that's true, and I think it goes without saying that most citizens are still trying to figure out what to think about coronavirus. I'm still trying to figure out what to think about it. How big of a deal was it that we got a late start on testing here in the United States? The health experts say that was a really big deal because this kind of spirals out of control exponentially. And if you don't get it early, then you really lose control of it. How many people are going to die because of it? I mean, that's an obvious question. Does President Trump bear some responsibility? Was it his fault somehow that we got a late start on testing? And of course, it matters a lot what happens next. I think one of the things and for those of us who've been, tell me if you disagree, Alexis, but for those of us who've been watching this unfold, Trump has, in a very short period of time, gone from being almost totally dismissive of this threat. He said it'll disappear. It'll be like magic. It's going to go away when it. I mean, there's a litany of things he said. Basically, don't worry about it. It's not a problem. And he is now saying it's a big, big deal. He himself is the one who actually came up with a more aggressive guideline than the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. They said no gatherings of 50 or more. He said, let's make that no gatherings of 10 or more. That's a guideline, not a law. We don't have martial law yet. So Trump has got a lot more serious about this. Reporters have been asking him in press conferences, what changed? I mean, what is it that really changed your mind here? He has not given a straightforward answer. In fact, he keeps saying, I've taken this very seriously all along, and the record is very clear that he did not take it seriously until only about the last week. One thing that could have changed is Trump had a come to Jesus moment, and he said, "Holy crap, this really could threaten my reelection. We could have a recession right on the edge of the election. I might have to explain 50,000 or 100,000 needless deaths to voters when they're about to go and decide whether to vote for me or not." So maybe that's why he got serious. So a lot is going to happen in the next 7 months. And I think a lot of it has to do with expectations that are being set right now. So Trump has created the expectation. He has been saying, we'll kind of be, the worst will be over by summertime. The health experts they don't know.
August timestamp on it.
Yeah.
Somebody said, how long might this go? And we saw the market reaction was very dramatic, very intense to the downside when he said that. And then when we got news that the Senate was close to passing stimulus, we saw the market rally.
Yeah. And, you're covering the markets more closely than I am. I mean, you should comment on this because this has been insane. We've got more volatility in markets than we did in 2008. And to my mind, the health threat right now it doesn't compare to anything we had in 2008. But the threat to the economy is nowhere near as severe now as it was then, because the whole banking system was collapsing.
We had a systemic problem, right, with the banking system. And it was a financial crisis. It was not a health crisis. So Wall Street's being reactionary to a health crisis. Thank goodness. I mean, all the analysts I've talked to say the banks have never been stronger and more capitalized than they are today. And they do believe that they're not going to need a bailout from the government and that they're going to be able to survive this and to help others survive it, namely people who have mortgages right now. They might be able to have a moratorium on, when is that next mortgage payment due? That the banks are this time around are actually in a position to help those who are going through hard times, as opposed to being the thing that made us go through a hard time back in 2008.
Yeah, and what happens with markets is going to have a lot to say with how the public views President Trump when what really matters is what people are thinking about President Trump, by about mid-October of last year. I mean, there are the significant voters, the swing voters, a lot of them don't make up their minds until the end. Now, I will go back to one thing I noticed. There was a poll by Axios, and they asked, it was a big poll. They did more than 8,000 people, and they asked, who do you trust? And what is your different trust level of the Center for Disease Control, these institutions that were, with the spokespeople handling it, and then President Trump himself. And there was one number on that poll that really stuck out to me, and that was President Trump's people who said, I trust President Trump. Republicans, it was in the 80%, 82%, I think, very high. That's not surprising. Democrats, almost no Democrats said they trust President Trump. But when they asked independents, 9%, right, single digits. But when they asked independents, only 28% said they trust President Trump on this. And to me, that is if you're Trump's reelection campaign, that is a red flag, because independents essentially helped him win in 2016. I mean, it's those people in the middle. They could be conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans or just registered independents. But those are the people who rejected Hillary Clinton. A lot of those people did vote for Trump, but it was an anti-Hillary Clinton vote. And we know how close it was in 2016. So if Trump is if he loses independents by a ratio of basically 3-1, I think he loses, period. So he has got to do something to
talk to you about the do something part, right? I mean, now it looks as though Washington is getting their acts together. I mean, as we sit here, the Senate has still not passed this fiscal stimulus plan, which I'm actually amazed by. I mean, the House had passed it on Friday. Here we are Tuesday, and nothing's been passed yet. And meanwhile, the thing is getting, the economy is falling deeper in holes. Now we have restaurants, bars, and a large swath of this country shut down. The service industry nearly shut down. Marriott coming out today and saying they're going to have to furlough thousands of workers as they temporarily shut down their hotels. I mean, what needs to happen between now and, say, really the next couple of weeks for maybe Trump to salvage this thing and people to say, all right, he stepped up. Once he understood the severity, it took a while. He stood up to the plate, and now he's doing the right aggressive thing.
Well, the template for this, Alexis, again, it really is 2008 and 2009. You covered that. I covered that. So at least, we're on a roller coaster feeling queasy, but at least we've kind of been down this hill before, right?
True.
So, I mean, the Great Recession playbook is really playing out again. So we've got the Federal Reserve doing all the emergency measures. That's basically the same as it did in 08 and 09. And now we're so that's monetary stimulus. And I'm about 95% sure that Congress is going to do all the fiscal stimulus that they did do in 2009. And I think it's going to be quite similar. So that means this bill that they're likely to pass soon, that's a small bill that has some immediate relief for people who are told to go home and just don't come to work. So if you do not have paid leave and if you do not have paid sick leave or emergency leave, the government's going to cover that for some workers. That is kind of small potatoes at this point. I mean, it's necessary, but it's obvious that we need cannons firing money into the economy at this point. And so that's what Congress is going to be debating over the next, I think it could easily take a month before something like that passes. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is saying we need this now, as in not tomorrow, as in now. Even the White House is now talking about just sending out checks to people to put some money in their pocket. The U.S. government has done that before. That happened in 2008. That was part of the playbook back then. Just give people money so they can spend. Especially lower income people who may not be able to make the next rent payment or are short on the food budget or whatever it might be. There's going to be, this kind of thing ends up to be a giant grab bag for every favorite pork product up on Capitol Hill. So that's where all the negotiations are going to be. The risk for Trump in this, so Congress is going to pass something. It's going to be big. It's not going to be as fast as people want it to be. That's just the way Congress operates. But I think the risks and opportunities, a couple of them here for Trump. Number one, he has to be very careful not to overpromise what the government can do. Actually, Obama overpromised on how quickly the stimulus package passed in 2009. Literally in the first month of Obama's presidency, he overpromised on how quickly that would get people back to work. And, come a year or two later, turns out jobs are not coming roaring back the way Obama kind of promised. And he actually put a number on it back then. And what actually happened was way worse than what his number projected. So he made the mistake of creating an expectation and actually pegging himself to a number that people could say, well, your program failed because it didn't do what you said it would do. Now, we're already hearing Trump make these kinds of promises. He's in some ways being careful not to put a number on it. So he's saying, I think we'll rebound really fast and it's going to be the greatest rebound ever. Well, he's not saying we're going to rebound by June or July. And I actually have my doubts about whether the rebound is going to be a sharp V-shaped rebound. Because
bounce back or not. No, I agree. Especially because if a lot of people are trying to recover from having lost a job that they just can't go step back into. I mean, maybe this means for a number of Americans, they lost their job during this pandemic and they didn't get it back for a while. And I don't care how much money the government's going to put in their pockets, they're going to want to hold on to that money, take care of the priority bills like housing and food, right? Shelter and food is going to come first. They're not going to be out there stimulating the economy in the way that we would be hoping they would. And also just in terms of 2008 versus now and these bailouts, I mean, I guess you can liken it to the TARP that we saw happening in 2008. Perhaps it won't be all that similar, Rick, in the sense that didn't we learn something from back then? We bailed out the auto industry. We bailed out the banks. And what did the banks and the auto industry do for us, right? Well, so now you've got the airlines looking for a bailout. And I think this time, or at least I hope this time, there are going to be some real conditions tacked onto that.
Yeah, I mean, we covered these stories for months, didn't we, in 2009 and 2010. The money that went to Goldman Sachs that ended up going to all these counterparties that why are we buying out, bailing out Deutsche Bank or something? That's the German government's problem. And they were, so I think the postmortem on the TARP bailouts and the auto bailouts, and I mean, boy, was there just alphabet soup of bailouts back then.
Yes.
What they needed to happen, and I think the Treasury Department and the Fed and everybody involved in those bailouts, especially with regard to the financial system, their mentality was, we need to do this as fast as humanly possible because we cannot have a seizure in the financial system. So as you pointed out earlier, we're not going to have a seizure in the financial system. The banks are not the problem this time around, thank God. So I think that means you can be a little more deliberate in terms of doing what you just described, which is put conditions on the bailout money. So, it's possible all the major airlines at this point could end up declaring bankruptcy if the government just says you're on your own. And that is probably not responsible. But it's also not responsible to say, here you go, American and United, here's a bunch of money. Use it for whatever you want. If you want to buy back shares and benefit shareholders, that's fine with us. There's no way that will fly. So Trump already has a problem here because on general, a majority of voters think that the tax cuts that he pushed through and he signed in 2017, a majority of voters already think those tax cuts heavily favored businesses and the wealthy and not the middle class. Too much of the benefit went to people who didn't need it. So Trump has to be very careful about signing a bailout bill that once again looks as if he's bailing out. And it's not just companies, but it's shareholders. Are you basically bailing out the shareholder class and just trying to make the stock price go back up? Or do you also have protections in there that's going to keep everybody on the payroll at those companies, make sure they have health insurance through this downturn? And I would hope that Congress and all the people in Washington learned that lesson from the last time around. Number one, you got to look out for the workers, the employees, and the customers, and worry about shareholders after that. So Republicans hate give-outs, except when they're the ones stuck in an emergency. Then they favor them. And the argument for doing that is, first of all, you can put limits on who gets the checks. I mean, the IRS, for example, knows your income for the prior year. So if your income for the prior year was above some threshold, I don't know what it would be. Let's say $200,000 per household or $100,000. You don't get anything, or it's it graduates up or down. But you give more to people with lower incomes who are going to be the people who need it. That goes straight to people. It doesn't get filtered through a company. It comes all at once. It's not a few bucks per paycheck. And it might do something to help confidence. Everybody gets a check. Suddenly everybody feels, well, at least somebody's doing something about this.
Look out for me.
It's also not filtered through a company. So, when you cut payroll taxes, businesses pay half the payroll tax. So if you cut payroll taxes, you would be cutting business taxes and individual taxes. And I think you'd be opening yourself to criticism, among people saying the business, help the people first, not the businesses. The other thing is, if you just got laid off, well, you don't have a paycheck, and therefore you're not going to benefit from a reduction in the tax on that paycheck because you're not getting that paycheck anymore.
Exactly. Well, we are in the throes of it right now, that is for sure. And the jury is still out on how this administration is handling this pandemic. We're really not going to know until we come out the other side of it. But Rick, you and I will be.
One question for you before we go. Everybody wants to know, when is the stock market going to bottom? When is the time to buy?
You think I have an answer?
You're covering it every minute of every day.
But we are here every day, Monday to Friday, to try to work it out and talk to really smart people to help us figure it out. So everybody, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for your patience and for joining us in this, like I said, this new normal that we're all dealing with. Be safe, be well, and be sure to follow me at Alexis TV News.
And me at Rick J. Newman.
Be well, everybody. See you next time.